Good evening. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you back to our LaRouche Pack Monday Strategic Overview and Discussion. And today is February the 12th. It is a day of great remembrance where we honor two great American statesmen. First of all, it is the birthday of President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of our great republic. And also, it is the anniversary, 5-year anniversary of the passing of statesman Lyndon LaRouche. And this discussion and topic tonight that I will be joined by Michael on is extremely important as we look at the devastation and the collapse happening in our society, happening in our culture, in our economy. And Michael themed this discussion tonight, Building Civilization Anew. And I think it's really important because this is the theme that we've been discussing that's going to be at the forefront of our new transformation that we're making with LaRouche Pack and our LaRouche Pack action to our new Promethean concept of man, Promethean action, and Promethean Pack, which we have been discussing and will be discussing further over the days to come. But as I said, today's discussion centered on building civilization anew is absolutely the direction we need to take. And what's been at the center of the leadership that's been embodied by Donald Trump and why he's been such a target in the midst of the total insanity that's continuing to go on in terms of the attack on our nation, on our republic. The idea of the sovereign nation state has been tremendously under attack. And this has been a result of a decline in our culture. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today, which will start with the question of what is the fight before us, what's actually going on. We're going to take up a couple of a bit of the political theme of what's happening right now. But I just do have to say, I know a lot of people have been bombarded when we look at just what's happening with our culture, the woke agenda, the green climate agenda. Malthusian is at the forefront of everything. And we see this by the bombardment that people are having with the insanity we saw last night that people can't really get away from right now, where you have this, strange ordeal that happened called a football game or a Super Bowl. And I know people are getting sick and tired of talking about that, but this is what we're facing right now in our society, where the question of bestiality is dominating our culture and our society. And what we experience with that circus show, from the standpoint that everything wasn't even centered around football. I didn't watch it. So sorry if people are getting offended because their team won. That's nice that your team won. But at the same time, as you sit there and you see that we had to have just a total woke operation, an anti-Christian, anti-human operation that was going on there. The focus on the Biden-loving Taylor Swift and her jab-loving, Pfizer-loving boyfriend there. It was a complete disaster. And so I'm bringing this up because people have to recognize that we're at a point right now where we cannot accept this quality of bestiality in our society anymore. Even if you want to call it entertainment, it really wasn't entertainment. And on top of it, the millions of dollars that people were putting in there to brainwash you around with these insane ads that they put out. So I needed to put that in there because I think it's extremely important to what we're facing right now and why we have to think about as all of that was going on, Biden was still you had bombings continuing in in the Middle East, and we'll talk about that from the standpoint of this continuous war drive, that if Trump was in the White House, we would be putting an end to this. And for those who might have missed the discussion on Saturday that I led, I think this gets to the core of it, that we need to focus on what Trump has called for, a renewing of our republic, new frontiers in development and science, putting an end to the perpetual wars. And we can't do that until we get leadership back in the White House and in our country, true leadership focused on the future, as President Trump has made his commitment to. In the meantime, you have a senile old man in the White House who cannot remember anything, and even the DOJ is now saying that, well, we can't go after him and we can't prosecute him because he is a senile old man who can't remember anything. Why is he the president? I asked that same question too. And also, what's actually behind that whole front? We're going to hear about that. And the last thing I'll just say on this is that we are now in the middle of, as many people are, engaging in the fight to put an end to the continued funding of Ukraine. As most people have seen, there's been a number of people who are calling for citizens to call their senators and demand that Ukraine funding and this whole insane bill be killed. So let's talk about that. Let's get into all of that a little bit more here. And I think this question, again, of defining the future and building civilization anew is a very good topic. And I look forward to hearing what Michael has to say.
Great. Thanks, Keisha. I want to start by reading a quote, and I'll just share the screen so people can read along. It's the highlighted section here. This is from the Constitutional Convention. It ended on September 17th, 1787. It was Benjamin Franklin's closing remarks. And you haven't read this or listened to it, it's worth doing. So this is just near the beginning. He says, "In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. And there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people, if well administered. And I believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other." Okay. So, I mean, the essence of this discussion over the last 3 years, and as people know, we're changing our name to Promethean Action. Benjamin Franklin was also known as the kind of the American Prometheus. Rightly so. He kind of stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind in many ways, as the myth Prometheus had done. But the fundamental question of these discussions of our movement, of what Lyndon LaRouche had intended, was that the role of the population was essential. That to neglect the population, to think that you can run and control history by the levers of bureaucracies and institutions or propaganda machines, or the Nazis or the Soviets or the British Empire, or any tyranny in history, Zeus, Rome, you name it, that you think you can control history by some small kind of choke points, the way the British Empire thought of international sea lanes, is a gross misconception of the course of history and the way the universe actually works. And this is the underlying problem of things like the obsession, partly which is just a financial boondoggle, of AI. There are some beneficial qualities to it, of machines doing things that are, pre-programmed to do things and think of, and respond to things. That's not AI. I mean AI as this general intelligence and robots taking over everything. There's a fundamental problem of associating human identity with programmable behavior. But the bigger problem, the bigger question we face is, how do we effectively move the population? So if we're not going to neglect them, if you have to take them into account, how do you? And this is what Lyndon LaRouche recognizes. One, if this enemy, which they do, our enemy today, this globalist British imperial force that operates, looks to neglect the population, they look to diminish voter turnout. That way they can, the less people that go to the polls, the more mail-in ballots they can just subscribe to them. But the point is that they don't want to elevate the population. So LaRouche recognized that the critical factor today, at this kind of moment, and we've reached that moment, we all know we've reached that moment. This is a determinative period. What happens with this presidential election in a manifold ways, from the world and foreign policy to our courts and our legal system and our constitutional republic, to our basic economy and livelihood and energy supply and food supply, let alone basic cultural questions, are all at stake. How do we reach the population effectively? How do we prevent the American people, as Benjamin Franklin put it, how do we prevent them from becoming capable of only being governed by despotism? Because isn't that the actual intention, right? Why they promote the Super Bowl, why they promote this kind of arena sports, why we have legalized crime. Why is gambling everywhere? How many, I didn't watch the Super Bowl either, but how many FanDuel commercials were on there? I mean, probably a lot. That was what organized crime did in the 20s and 30s, and now, or 40s and 50s. Now it's just legalized business activity. Well, it's the same people running it. They didn't do it because it was illegal. They did it because it was easy money. Now we're just legalizing the criminality. And the same can be true on Wall Street and the Federal Reserve. That's the big racket. So we've degraded the population. But the amazing factor today, and I'm going to get back to this at the end, but I also wanted to start with it and Benjamin Franklin's quote, is because the ability for the population today, since COVID, to mobilize in a self-governing way. And we see it with fights over the Michigan Republican Party in Michigan. We've seen fights like that in Nebraska. We'll see fights like that in other places. We saw the people in Nebraska rise up and denounce their senator for that horrible immigration bill that they tried to ram through the Senate. Across the country, and we've talked about this for years now, in the counties, in the state parties, there is a grassroots phenomena. It's somewhat uncontrolled, it's raw, it's undisciplined at times, but it is a committed devotion to take responsibility to govern our country. It is very much the essence of self-government. It is a rejection of the threat of despotism, not by screaming at City Hall, but by actually taking the responsibility to govern the country. That is going to be the essential difference in this election. It is that factor, your involvement and the ability for you to engage others out of their cynicism and out of their apathy, which will be the fundamental difference to this election, because the enemy cannot deploy towards the population in that way. And they cannot calculate to what extent this phenomenon will have an impact on the population. But everyone in politics admits one thing: the engagement of citizens with one another in person is the most powerful aspect of voter outreach and political engagement. And if you have an increasing number of people taking real responsibility, we have a chance to change the course of history. Now, the American project, as the email mentions, is of the greatest importance. The institutions, we all see it, the institutions of the church, of the various main religions, of science itself. I mean, it's hard not to find a scientific discussion on a major podcast or a major forum, where it's popularizing science. It's science for the average person that doesn't include drug use. I mean, I don't know how many people, whether it's the Joe Rogan process, but the level of psychedelic experimentation and just general drug use has become interlinked with scientific thought in our culture today. That alone is destroying science, let alone all the other problems of reductionism and so on. There's no institution, but the formation of our country has become the most important. And one of the most important interventions we've seen in some time happened this past week. It's worth touching on, and it kind of bridges us directly into the strategic situation. That is the intervention by Tucker Carlson to interview Vladimir Putin for 2 hours. Because what Tucker did, and he was in Dubai today at the United Arab Emirates at a global government council event. I'm not sure what it was. We can post links to the stuff in the chat. But Tucker, his intervention gave hope that there may be a chance for the United States to come back to what the United States should be. And Tucker can do that with legitimate potential. There's a real burgeoning threat that we reemerge because of the efforts, not of just Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump, but because of citizens responding. Citizens responding not just to the need to take political responsibility, but to recognize, as many have increasingly, that this is a much deeper cultural warfare. What are the ideas of history? What is the meaning of 1776? What was the role of Washington and Lincoln? Who were these people? And that's certainly been a part of what we've tried to do over these last few years. Now, hopefully everyone watched Tucker's interview, but if you didn't, your busy 2-hour-long interview, it is a powerful intervention. Tony Pappert of Promethean Action did post an article today, and that can be posted in the chat from LaRouchePack.com. That gives you an important background to what actually happened between US and Russia policy. And you've got people out there like Jeffrey Sachs, this kind of, I call them like the sweatophiles, because they always act like they're just your grandfather wearing a nice sweater, the same people that run the Lincoln Project against Trump. Act like they're so sweet and nice and have never had a bad intention their whole lives. But he's all over the internet now doing interviews, acting like some apologist for American empire and how bad we are. He was there as part of a demonic force looting Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. But Tony gives real perspective. But there's two very, very important elements to that interview by Tucker. The one, Putin has never been closed to negotiation. That the opportunity for negotiation has been there from the very beginning. People might remember the Russians came in from the north, from Belarus, directly to the outskirts of Kiev, the very beginning of the war. This is like March of 2022. And March, April. And at the same time, they were in negotiations in Istanbul on behalf of the president of Turkey, Erdogan, and the prime minister of Israel. And the Russians and the Ukrainians, Zelensky's regime, the parliamentary leadership of Ukraine and Russia were in direct negotiations. And they were even initialing the documents saying that, yes, we're giving formal commitment that this is going to be under review by our governments. This is the leading parliamentarian or parliament member, the leader of the Zelensky faction in the Ukraine parliament, signing and initialing these documents. Part of it was that Putin, to fulfill that, Putin and Russia had to, that was strange. I don't know if people saw that. Putin and the Russians had to pull back the Russian forces from the north of Kiev, and they did. And of course, this was considered a great victory in the Western press. The Ukrainians drove the Russians out of Kiev. All that propaganda aside. there were real negotiations. Boris Johnson, everyone says Boris Johnson did it on behalf of Biden. But the reality is Boris Johnson did it on behalf of the British Empire, went to Istanbul, went to Kiev and said, you're not negotiating. We will back you entirely and completely. So, and that shut down negotiations. Zelensky pulled out. Now, Putin has never denied now the opportunity for negotiations. And he says, we'll never be beaten, but we're constantly open for negotiations. And the longer the war draws on, the terms for Russia may change. But the ability to end the killing, think of the killing, 500,000 Ukrainian men dead, 500,000. That seems to be a basic estimate shared by many at this point, even from the people in Ukraine. And probably another 500,000 wounded, and probably 15 million of the country gone. There's probably less than 20 million even in the country now. Just a devastated area, devastated nation. Putin's constantly been open to that negotiation. It could happen now. And of course, there's implications for the US Congress in that regard, isn't there? The second thing that Putin did, but many Americans will miss the context. He talked about one that he asked Bill Clinton if they could join NATO. Bill said it was open to it. He asked George Bush if we could work together on a missile defense system. George Bush said, we think about it. In each case, the president came back and said, basically, my establishment says, go to hell. But more politely, but basically go to hell. But you don't need to worry. It's not about you. It's not about Russia. Nonetheless, Putin came back to this question of missile defense system multiple times and the willingness of Russia to work with the United States on a missile defense system. He did it with emphasis 2 or 3 times during the speech. Now, the reason that's so important, but many may miss the context, is that not only has Donald Trump, and Keisha gave a remarkable presentation on Saturday regarding President Trump's Uncle John, an MIT scientist who helped work on and was part of the SDI project of Reagan, the laser defense system, something that Lyndon LaRouche was one of the main authors of in the United States beginning in 1977. Well, Donald Trump, at his announcement speech in December of 2022, to announce his presidential campaign for this election, gave explicit reference towards the end of his speech towards a missile defense system of the United States. And the only way you can have a missile defense system of the United States is a satellite-based, space-based, laser-based missile defense system to drive the technology, to drive the science. So in some sense, Putin is offering not only an ability to collaborate with the United States, but to finally achieve what Reagan and LaRouche and great patriots in previous generation had hoped to accomplish, that the United States and Russia could work together to achieve a collaborative alliance to end the threat of nuclear annihilation. Powerful, powerful offering that Tucker himself probably missed. He was kind of caught off guard by a lot of it, but he's good in that sense because he doesn't come in with a lot of assumptions. He knows a lot of the reference points, but he was also somewhat surprised. Putin also gave a long history lesson, which caught a lot of fanfare. But those two elements, the openness to negotiate and the real question of an offering to a potential incoming President Trump. Now, as I said, there are implications of that intervention, but let me just reference again, that interview, 2 hours long, Tucker went and discussed it for 45 minutes in Dubai today. It was an international intervention. It is reawakening people that there is a real political opposition. You can only imagine what other people in other countries must think about the political dynamic in the United States. Luckily, Tucker's probably available. The internet now, people can catch various things. But many people are forlorn over the collapse and degeneracy and insanity of the American government. As Tucker said in Dubai, all these actions over the last 20, 30 years have been done in our name. And yet most Americans don't have any idea, which is true. And we've got to make sure that they do know and they take some responsibility. But to give the international community of leaders and people that are invested into the policies and orientation of a peaceful world and their own nation's basic development can be heartened by the idea that Tucker represents a large political faction in the country, which he certainly does. And it's also a much younger demographic than any other journalist or news person in the whole United States could represent. So that's an important thing just to think about. But let's come back to the fight in the United States, because the Senate on Super Bowl Sunday, was passing $100 billion, or about to pass. There's a lot of procedural hurdles here, but is about to pass probably on Tuesday and pass another hurdle on Sunday, a bill for $100 billion. Now, Trump came out and said, all of this should be loans. What are we giving money? We have $34 trillion in debt. I mean, the money printing machine is coming to an end. You can just feel the Rube Goldberg machine that prints it just rattling and not holding together any longer. But so they want to pass this legislation. Now, there's opposition in the Senate, but it's unlikely to prevent the bill from getting passed. So there's an opportunity, as Keisha said, to call your senator now and read them the riot act, that they have lost their mind. $60 billion to Ukraine, 500,000 men dead, as many casualties, if not more, the threat of world war, the threat of nuclear war, and the president of Russia has just said, we can talk. I've been opening to talk the entire time. We could have settled this 2 years ago in negotiations. Even after it started, we could still negotiate. Before it started, we could negotiate. Hold on one second. So so we should make sure our senators understand the risks involved and this absolute senility, not just of Biden, but this entire Senate. What are they thinking? What can they possibly be imagining? Now, at the same time, this has to get passed through the House. Now, there has been opposition to this. Part of the immigration bill that Barbara Boyd mentioned last week, which was 5,000 immigrants a day with work visas, just this obscene legislation of an open border policy saying that it was going to close the border, was part of the package, because the House has said we're not passing Ukraine aid if we're not going to help secure Ukraine's border if we don't secure our own. Well, of course, they're not going to pass any legitimate legislation to close the border. They don't even have to. Biden could just do it. But secondly, so they've removed that. Now they want to send this just to the House. We should intervene in the Senate. Marjorie Taylor Greene, among others, but her specifically, have said she would call for the ouster of Speaker Johnson if he passed Ukraine aid without securing the U.S. border. So the opportunity to intervene in the House is also at a very, very high-pitched level. The Senate will be on recess for 2 weeks, basically once they pass this bill. There's another $20 billion there's for Israel, and then another 10 for Taiwan and Indo-Pacific. All of that circles back to the military-industrial complex. All of this comes back to, Biden was even arguing earlier that we need this money to keep manufacturing jobs in the United States. These people have lost their minds. There is no moral fortitude, but we all know that in this call. That's not the question. The question more so is our ability to intervene and create an ongoing, continuous sense of presence of the American people to no longer tolerate these globalist shenanigans, to shut them down, to shut down this war machine, and to make it clear we're going to hold our government accountable to the principles of our Constitution. So there's probably more to be said. Just the other thing that happened in Ukraine last week, partly under the behest of Victoria, the Nazi Newland, was Zelensky did replace the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, replaced them with a person who's despised by the army, basically drove the Bakhmut policies of a meat grinder. We'll do the same thing there, but there are reports along the entire front line of massive incursions by the Russians. They're going to do some kind of hardcore, like shoot you. If you don't join the army, you're dead. You're shot on the spot kind of mobilization. The panic and desperation is massive. The attempt to try to stabilize Zelensky's government. The reason he replaced the former commander-in-chief was a guy named Zaluzhny, was because Zaluzhny was a political threat to Zelensky. So the whole regime is incredibly unstable. But the same can be said if we come back to the United States. The desperation in Ukraine, the rush to try to hold Zelensky in power to prevent a possible coup, and to grind up Ukraine even more in this ongoing perpetual war with Russia, to not concede an inch. Real Hitler-like mentality. You see the desperation and panic to hold the Biden regime together. So last week, this report came out from Robert Hur, special counsel and U.S. attorney from Maryland or Delaware. Did a report on Biden and classified documents. Lo and behold, Biden has tons of them going back to the 1970s when he was a senator. They're all over the place. They're in his office in Washington. They're in his office in Pennsylvania. They're in his house in Delaware. They're in garages. They're in storage locations. They're just everywhere. He committed multiple crimes. Barbara Boyd has posted it on our website. And of course, he's committed treason. He's committed violations of the Espionage Act. He's violated intelligence protocols. I mean, you name it. But Hur says we can't indict him or prosecute him because he really is an adult old man who has a lot of sympathy, and the jury won't convict him, and so there's no reason to try him. Okay, so clearly someone decided to put Biden under the bus, and then they marched him out into a press conference where the first question was given to the Fox reporter who just blasted him, and Biden flipped the lid. He blew a fuse, smoke coming out of the ears, pissed off, because unlike every other press conference, the people who are going to ask questions aren't already pre-listed. The questions they're going to ask and the answers he should give are not written down. So Biden was basically thrown to the wolves at really the lowest moment of his presidency in terms of the kind of the attack against his own ability to function, which sent a signal that the wolves, that certain Democrats, likely the Obama faction, realize, like Zelensky is collapsing and Ukraine is collapsing, that alone could sink this regime, at least in the election process. That can Biden handle such a foreign policy disaster? I mean, it's hard to imagine, but Biden campaigned as a foreign policy expert with tons of experience. And Hillary Clinton literally came out today and said, or yesterday, Biden should keep going out there and talking about all the great experience he has to lead the country. That's what she did. These people are just moronic, and we should be just retired and put in a safe place. So will Biden survive into the election is unclear. And of course, that isn't the point, but of what we do. They will have some opponent, but it's worth addressing that if Biden is removed, and Kamala Harris came out and said she's ready to serve today. So if they want to pull the 25th Amendment and say he's incompetent, can't carry the responsibility, she'll step in now. Kamala Harris is a horrible politician. She's even a worse political leader, but she's a really bad politician. She can't campaign. She started out at the top of the 2020 primaries and collapsed and didn't even end up in a primary contest. She was so bad. They're likely, if this happens, will be done as late as August at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, no less, the famous city of Chicago, Obama's city. If that were to happen, it will be an entirely oligarchical It will be corporate lobbyists and corporate interests and global corporate interests picking a candidate. Could be Newsom, could be Whitmer, could be the guy from Chicago. If it's one of those three governors, Pritzker from Illinois, Newsom from California, Whitmer from Michigan, just realize all three states have a net outflow of people from those states for years now. So they're picking people who people are running away from. So we'll see. It's going to be an incredibly unstable political period. But what is clear in all of this, and part of the panic to likely drop Biden out, besides the Ukraine fiasco, besides the fact that Biden has not had the chutzpah or the strength to tell Israel to knock it off, to stop escalating a conflict that you cannot win. Regardless of what anyone thinks of what Israel should do and what Israel needs to do, in terms of what the United States need to do in this regard, you don't let this war expand. You do not. So that's a failure, and he's got a huge protest from the Arab and Muslim community in the United States. Is the fact that the attempts to bring down Trump have failed, and this is really the kind of the last thing I want to mention. Is just to give people a sense that Trump's legal fight. There was a Supreme Court case last week, and the argument from this is to take Trump off the Colorado ballot. The argument from the Colorado lawyers was no less than, we could indict him. We could have a criminal indictment of Trump for insurrection. There's U.S. code that criminalizes insurrection, but we haven't done that. We held a hearing for a state district judge that assumed he committed insurrection, and we heard testimony about how we know we committed insurrection. And she decided to rule that indeed, in fact, he did commit insurrection, but she doesn't have the power to take him off the ballot, more or less. And because that judge found that presumption of insurrection is true, you, the Supreme Court, should now no longer abide by a constitutional system. You should become a Supreme Council, in essence. You should rule on behalf of an oligarchy that denounces insurrection, and to prove your heartfelt sincerity in being against insurrection, should agree with us that Donald Trump should not be able to be on the ballot. And you know that he committed insurrection. We don't even really have to discuss it, because you all know what speech he gave at the Ellipse on January 6th. Now, they said one other thing, which is just worth noting. And then I want to make a larger point. They also said, they were questioned by, I think, Samuel Alito on the premise of their argument was that we have the right to determine the electors. Whatever electors are sent to Washington on January 6th, on the day to count the delegate votes and decide the presidency, to confirm the presidential election by the Congress, we, the state, have the right to send whatever delegates we want. We have that constitutional power. So the Samuel Alito asked them, could you send delegates for Biden? Could you pass legislation 3 days before the election saying that you're going to send only delegates for Joe Biden? And the Colorado lawyer said, yeah, we could do that. We couldn't do it after the election, but we could do it 3 days before. So when we say it's going to be unstable, you clearly can tell they don't give anything about what they said about the last January 6th. They will throw the next one into complete chaos if they have to. They'll plan their own insurrection on J6 if they have to. So the point is that the panic and desperation is setting in. Those arguments are insane, but they do raise the very clear question. And Trump's lawyers handled it very well. It's likely to be a unanimous decision. It may break 8-1, but it will likely be unanimous, or could be unanimous. No reason to qualify it, but it could very well be unanimous. And the question is, are we a republic or are we an oligarchy? Are we actually a nation governed by the population? Or as we see the tendency, but oligarchy would be so much easier. It's so much simpler. And it's very much harkens back to what Benjamin Franklin said, that the people smoking pot every day are on psychological drugs for therapy, for anxiety, for depression, which is like a 30% of the population, 30% of adults, especially women, children on all kinds of SSRIs and so on. We have drugged our population pharmaceutically, casual drug use. We're turning people into almost incapable of self-government. And to such a degree that actual lawyers will go to the Supreme Court and say, disregard the entire constitutional process of a person is innocent until proved guilty, and just pronounce that we all agree Trump committed insurrection. It's obvious. We don't really need a hearing. Just kick him off the ballot. It was frightening. It was humorous, but it was frightening because of how childish such practices are, and ultimately what an oligarchical culture does. And it is time to really denounce the oligarchy. And this gets to the point that the legal fight, the implications of this, though, are huge. Trump has appealed to the Supreme Court now in the immunity case from Washington, D.C. He just submitted that today. Tonight, I saw it in the news reported. This will mean, and it's not likely the Supreme Court will take this up with any haste. So the immunity case, the whole question of insurrection and what Trump, or whatever Trump did, what they accuse him of doing, disrupting a federal process on January 6th, could not be heard until even after the election. The Colorado case is a certain win for Trump. The Florida case of having documents in Mar-a-Lago, one, Trump still had his presidential security clearance. They hadn't removed it when they raided his house. Whoops, didn't check that box. And secondly, Biden has just been exposed as the most malignant case of this type of massive abuse, who never had presidential security clearance, which is a security clearance by which you can declare things declassified. Biden never had that throughout his 50 years when all these documents were stored. So there's no motivation for Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida to move forward. Trump is winning on the legal front big time. In Georgia, Fani Willis and her prosecutor and paramour, I forget his first name, Wade is the last name, they were in trial today in a court to decide if they were going to go to court, actually have a hearing to determine if she should be disqualified because she's clearly involved in a sexual relationship of personal financial interest, and she hired the same guy with no experience to prosecute a president. You probably all know the details: $700,000, barely any work, direct collusion with the Biden DOJ. This guy, Wade, the lawyer, went to the White House twice to meet with the Department of Justice officials. So the judge at the hearing today said, yeah, there's enough evidence. Miss Fani Willis could be disqualified from this case. We're going to go to court. That goes on Thursday. We'll see what happens. But certainly, it's gotten a lot worse for them in Georgia. And it's certainly pushing the time frame of all of this further and further and further beyond the election, which, of course, is the most probably critical factor. Obviously, the whole thing should be shut down. So all of this hinges then basically around the Stormy Daniels case in New York City, which is yet to be determined. Of course, you've got the lawsuits and attacks on Trump's business. All of that will be appealed. The E. Jean Carroll case will be appealed. It's costing Trump a ton of money. It's sucking a ton of money out of this. It's making Trump vulnerable. But as we know, it's the fight and devotion Trump has, which is touching the American people, and the American people can see what's taking place. So hopefully that gives people a review of the developments that have occurred over the last week. Really huge, big week. Things keep developing. But I come back because it's not so much to follow all of these things. It's very clear. And it's been a remarkable process to watch over the last 3 years. The engagement of citizens like yourselves and others that you know of who are engaged in this kind of political mobilization. We are now the determining factor. We are the X factor. We are the factor that the enemy can't comprehend, doesn't understand, and itself can't deploy. They can deploy mobs of the vox populi into the street, threatening chaos and burning down buildings and threatening Supreme Court justices' lives. They can do all the threats and noise and furor. But can they mobilize their citizens to actually engage in a sense of a vision, a sense of justice, a sense of righteousness, of humility, of real citizenry, of real responsibility? No, they can't ask them to do that. They can ask them to scream in anger and outrage, drug-filled outrage, but that's about it. We represent an actual viable political army, an intellectual army of ideas about the future. And if we prepare and arm ourselves, not just with a sense that things can simply be better, we can put some of these demons back where they belong, but that we can actually re-inspire our nation around it, and even under a new idea, a new conception of what we can become as a nation and what kind of world our nation can help build and construct. Then I think we are an unstoppable, not just political force, but a historical one, because it's never been demonstrated that it's been demonstrated frequently throughout history, that when you have such movements with such devotion and such clarity of idea, that the change is miraculous. And certainly I think we all know our nation needs a miracle today, but that miracle is one that we create. So I'll leave my comments there. I'm sure there's a lot more to say, but I want to hear from you guys. Keisha and I both want to find out what you're thinking, find out your questions. So maybe Keisha wants to respond to some of what I said, but open it up for you guys and let's see what we got.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Like we want to hear what you all have to say. I think should have provoked some good discussion here.